The year was 1453, and Constantinople had just fallen. The Byzantine Empire, a remnant of Rome itself, lay in ashes, and the young Sultan Mehmed II, forever remembered as Mehmed the Conqueror, stood triumphant. But victory alone did not satisfy him. He wanted fear, obedience, and silence from all who resisted. The Ottomans were not strangers to cruelty, but under Mehmed's hand, a particular method of terror would become his signature: impalement. A slow, agonizing punishment designed not only to kill, but to turn the body itself into a spectacle, a warning that resistance meant unthinkable suffering. The practice was not invented by the Ottomans. Persians, Assyrians, and even medieval Europeans had used it. But Mehmed refined it into an art of domination. His soldiers carried sharpened stakes into conquered lands, planting them like crops, turning battlefields into forests of writhing corpses. For the common villager, the horror began when the soldiers arrived. Villages that resisted even slightly were punished with impalements in the center square. Men were dragged out, stripped, and pinned to the ground as stakes were driven through them. Women and children were forced to watch as screams filled the air. The method was brutal in its detail. A sharpened pole, often greased to prolong the agony, was forced into the body, sometimes through the rectum, sometimes through the abdomen. Care was taken not to pierce the vital organs too quickly. Victims could live for hours, even days, twisting in agony as their weight slowly pulled them down the stake. When Mehmed marched through Serbia, Wallachia, and the Balkans, the stakes multiplied. Roads leading into towns became lined with rows of impaled prisoners, their bodies swaying like grotesque signposts. Travelers described the stench of death lingering for miles, and birds circling endlessly above the fields of the impaled. The sight was more than just punishment. It was psychological warfare. Soldiers and villagers alike learned that the Sultan did not forgive rebellion. Even whispering defiance could mean one's body would be left to rot on a stake, exposed to sun, rain, and scavengers. Chroniclers described fields where hundreds, even thousands, were impaled at once. These were not random acts, but orchestrated displays. Mehmed knew that the terror of impalement did what swords and muskets could not. It broke the will of nations before battle was even fought. Captured soldiers suffered the same fate. Defenders of small fortresses, once overwhelmed, were not granted mercy. Instead, they were paraded before their comrades and slowly raised onto stakes. The screams echoed across valleys, reminding survivors that surrender was not always salvation. The cruelty was deliberate. Mehmed wanted his reputation to spread farther than his armies could march. Word of impalements reached Europe, carried by merchants and priests, whispered across taverns and courts. The Sultan of the Ottomans was not just a conqueror, he was the architect of fear. In Wallachia, the terror took on a special dimension. Vlad III, later called Dracula, rose as both enemy and mirror to Mehmed. He too used impalement as a weapon, copying Ottoman cruelty and turning it against them. The two men created a grim rivalry, where forests of stakes became the battleground of terror itself. When Vlad impaled Ottoman soldiers, Mehmed responded with greater fury. In campaigns through the Danube and beyond, his armies left thousands of corpses behind. Diplomats wrote of forests of men, rows so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground between the stakes. Villages learned quickly: pay tribute or face impalement. Those who submitted lived in misery, but those who resisted saw their kin raised upon stakes, their homes burned, their children enslaved. The choice was always brutal servitude or unthinkable death. The symbolism of the stake was as powerful as the pain it inflicted. It was domination not only of the body, but of the spirit. To be impaled was to become a permanent warning. Flesh turned into message. Agony turned into law. Even within his empire, Mehmed used impalement to enforce loyalty. Janissaries who mutinied, governors who betrayed him, or citizens accused of treason, all were subjected to the stake. No rank or status shielded one from his wrath. Witnesses spoke of the slow silence that fell after executions. Once the screams died, only the creak of wood and the buzz of flies filled the air. Corpses remained for days, their twisted shapes reminders that the Sultan's justice was as merciless as it was absolute. Travelers entering Ottoman lands knew they were stepping into a realm where terror lived on the roadside. Chroniclers wrote that one could measure Mehmed's conquests not just in cities taken, but in stakes planted, each one a monument to suffering. And yet, the cruelty worked. Entire regions surrendered before his armies arrived, terrified of the fate that awaited them if they resisted. Impalement had become not only execution, but strategy, a weapon as potent as cannon or sword. Mehmed the Conqueror's empire grew, and with it the legend of his fields of death. Wherever he marched, the stakes followed, carrying the screams of his victims into eternity. By the late 1450s, Mehmed II had become more than just a conqueror. He was a spectre haunting the lands of Eastern Europe. His victories had left trails of corpses, and yet his hunger for dominance only grew. To him, impalement was not merely punishment, it was a theatre of horror that announced his power more loudly than banners or trumpets ever could. When his armies swept into Serbia, resistance was met with ruthless efficiency. In towns that defied him, every man of fighting age was impaled. Mothers and children were forced to march past the rows of screaming bodies, taught that their future depended on obedience. The cries of the dying became the lullabies of submission. In Bosnia, the stakes multiplied. Along mountain roads and riversides, Ottoman soldiers planted poles bearing their victims like grotesque fruit. Travelers wrote of pathways where one could not walk without stepping on the blood-soaked earth, and of air so heavy with the stench of rot that even hardened soldiers gagged. Impalement was not a quick spectacle. It was a long-drawn agony meant to be seen. Victims hung for hours, even days, as crows tore at their eyes and insects burrowed into their flesh. Each groan, each writhing twitch of the impaled kept fear alive in those forced to watch. Mehmed's cruelty was precise. Stakes were sharp and smooth, sometimes greased, to prevent tearing the organs too quickly. Victims were lifted carefully so the pole would miss the heart, keeping them alive longer. The goal was not death alone, it was endurance, a performance of pain that terrified entire communities. Chroniclers described one campaign where over 3,000 prisoners were impaled in a single valley. The corpses lined the hillsides, forming a grisly amphitheater of death. Survivors reported that even the Ottoman soldiers, accustomed to cruelty, fell silent at the sheer scale of the carnage. The message was always the same: to resist was to die slowly. Even before Ottoman armies reached the gates of a town, whispers of the stake spread like wildfire. Villagers, remembering the screams of their neighbors, often surrendered without a fight. Fear had done its work before the sword was drawn. In the Balkans, rebellions smoldered constantly, but Mehmed ensured that each uprising ended in blood and wood. Rebels captured alive were spared no mercy. The sight of their leaders writhing on stakes outside the town gates turned hope into despair. Their courage melted as they watched their heroes reduced to tortured warnings. Foreign envoys carried these tales back to Europe. Reports of Ottoman impalements horrified the courts of Hungary, Venice, and Rome. Priests described it as the work of the devil himself, claiming Mehmed had turned the earth into a hell where sinners screamed without end. Yet for all their outrage, few dared to confront him directly. The most infamous confrontation came with Vlad III of Wallachia. Vlad was a man forged in the same crucible of cruelty, and he mirrored Mehmed's methods with savage devotion. When Ottomans entered Wallachian lands, they found thousands of their comrades impaled in forests, their bodies swaying like grisly banners. But Mehmed would not be outdone. In retaliation, his armies carved through Wallachia, leaving behind fields of their own impaled captives. The rivalry between the Sultan and Vlad turned Eastern Europe into a nightmare landscape, where villages were forced to choose between two lords of the stake. One account tells of a battle where captured Wallachian soldiers were impaled within sight of their families. The Ottomans made parents watch as their sons died slowly, and wives wept as their husbands screamed upon the stakes. The cruelty was not accidental. It was engineered to crush the human spirit. Villages that paid tribute were left alone, though always under the shadow of the stake. Tribute collectors carried with them the memory of past impalements, and that memory was often enough to fill their sacks without protest. The stakes had become invisible soldiers, fighting Mehmed's wars even in his absence. Prisoners of war fared no better. Christian knights captured in raids were not given the dignity of ransom. Instead, many were displayed impaled before the walls of their own castles, their final screams echoing to the defenders within. The message was unmistakable. Mercy had no place in Mehmed's world. Yet the terror worked. City after city opened its gates rather than risk the stake. The Ottomans expanded deeper into Europe, their path cleared not just by cannon fire, but by fear itself. Impalement had become a weapon of conquest as effective as any army. Merchants traveling through Ottoman lands often returned with haunting tales. They spoke of seeing fields dotted with poles, bodies in various stages of decay, bones still clinging to wood like grotesque ornaments. For months, even years, the corpses remained, silent guardians of the Sultan's authority. Those who lived near these forests of the dead could not escape their presence. Children grew up under the shadow of the stake, learning from an early age that the Sultan's justice was merciless. The smell of decay mingled with daily life, and the sight of skeletons on stakes became a normal part of the landscape. In time, Mehmed's reputation reached far beyond the lands he ruled. To Europeans, he was not only the conqueror of Constantinople, but the master of a new kind of terror. The stake became his calling card, a symbol etched into the memory of nations. And yet, for Mehmed, it was never enough. Each campaign brought fresh impalements, each rebellion new forests of the dead. His empire grew on blood and wood, and with every stake planted, his legend darkened further. By the 1460s, the name Mehmed carried with it not just power but dread. Where his armies marched, death by impalement followed. Fields of the impaled marked his victories, each one a reminder that resistance against the Sultan was not only futile, it was unbearable. By the 1470s, Mehmed II's empire stretched from the Balkans to Anatolia, from the Black Sea to the Aegean. His armies had become unstoppable, his fleets commanded the seas, and his reputation reached across Europe. But behind the banners of victory, one symbol followed him everywhere: the stake. For Mehmed, impalement was no longer just a punishment for rebels, it was a language of rule. With every campaign, he carved messages of power into the land itself. Every pole that bore a human body spoke the same words: fear, obedience, silence. In Greece, captured rebels were impaled along the roads leading to Athens. In Albania, villages that had sided with Skanderbeg were punished with forests of corpses, their bodies left to rot beneath the mountain winds. The stake was not reserved for warriors alone. Peasants, priests, and even children were raised upon it. One Venetian chronicler wrote of traveling through Ottoman lands and counting hundreds of stakes still bearing skeletons. Some were so old that the flesh had long rotted away, leaving only bones dangling in the wind. Others were fresh, their victims still twitching in agony, eyes begging for mercy that never came. The Sultan's cruelty was deliberate, never random. To him, the stake was a tool sharper than any blade. Mercy bred hope, but terror killed it. By ensuring that suffering was slow and public, he stripped resistance of its fire before it could ignite. Witnesses described the impalements in grisly detail. Victims sometimes begged their executioners to strike them down, but the soldiers obeyed their orders carefully. Avoid the heart, avoid the lungs, let the man live long enough to scream. It was agony stretched into spectacle, torture designed to echo across generations. The forests of the impaled became infamous in Wallachia. When Mehmed marched to confront Vlad III in 1462, he was greeted not by armies, but by a landscape of horror. Vlad had impaled 20,000 people along the road, their bodies forming a forest so vast that Mehmed himself was said to pause in silence. Even then, Mehmed was not deterred. He returned the cruelty in kind, and his campaigns in Wallachia left behind their own fields of death. The rivalry between the two rulers made the stake more than a weapon. It became a symbol of their contest, two men measuring their power in the agony of their enemies. Inside the empire, impalement remained the Sultan's ultimate punishment. Janissaries who mutinied were hoisted upon stakes, their bodies displayed before their comrades as a lesson in loyalty. Governors accused of corruption or treachery suffered the same fate, their screams carrying into the night as warnings to others. Ordinary citizens, too, were not beyond his wrath. Villagers accused of harboring deserters or withholding taxes found themselves raised upon stakes outside their own homes. The message was merciless. One act of defiance would condemn not just the guilty, but their entire community. For those who lived under Ottoman rule, the stake became part of daily life. Farmers tilled their fields with corpses watching from nearby roads. Children grew up with nightmares of being taken by soldiers and lifted onto wood. Fear became as constant as the air they breathed. The psychological weight of impalement extended beyond the victims. Armies facing the Ottomans often faltered when they saw prisoners already impaled near the battlefield. Courage withered at the sight of comrades dying slowly, their bodies nailed to wood, their voices turned into shrieks that echoed across the plain. Yet for all its cruelty, the strategy worked. Cities surrendered before his armies arrived, rebellions crumbled before they spread, and entire regions submitted out of terror. Mehmed's empire thrived not only on conquest, but on fear, and the stake was the cornerstone of that fear. Foreign observers painted Mehmed as a monster. In European courts, he was called the terror of Christendom. Priests thundered in sermons that the Sultan was the hand of Satan himself, his forests of the impaled proof of divine punishment upon the world. The horror traveled faster than his armies ever could. But within his empire, the stake was accepted as law. To resist was to die slowly. To obey was to live in fear. This was the balance Mehmed demanded, and few dared to challenge it. Even whispers of rebellion carried the taste of wood and blood. As the years passed, Mehmed's use of impalement became legend. Stories told of entire valleys filled with stakes, of roads where corpses guided the traveler like milestones. Some accounts may have exaggerated the numbers, but the fear they spread was real enough to keep nations trembling. When Mehmed died in 1481, he left behind not only an empire, but a legacy carved into human flesh. His successors inherited the stake as a tool of rule, and impalement continued in Ottoman lands for centuries. The practice outlived him, its shadow stretching across generations. To this day, the memory of Mehmed's impalements haunts the histories of the Balkans. Villages still tell tales of ancestors who vanished upon stakes, of fields where the wind once carried the screams of the dying. His forests of the impaled became scars upon the land, scars that never fully healed. Mehmed the Conqueror is remembered as a genius of war, a builder of empires, and a ruler of vision. Yet beneath those titles lies the darker truth. His empire was cemented not only by stone and steel, but by wood driven through flesh, by bodies turned into monuments of terror. And so, long after the stakes rotted and the corpses fell to dust, the legend remained. Mehmed's name carried not only the glory of conquest, but the chill of fear, a reminder that empires can be built not just on power but on pain. His fields of death became part of history itself, an eternal warning carved in screams.